Hello, everybody, and welcome to the latest edition of the Georgetown University Wargaming Society webinar series. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. James Fielder and Cadet Nick Kauza from Colorado State University. Today, they're going to be talking about designing and executing Air Force ROTC wargames. So before I turn the mic over to them, I'm going to just say, if you have any questions, please put them in the text chat there down at the bottom, and we will get to those. The speakers will get to those at the end of the presentation or as they see fit. So without further ado, Dr. Fielder, take us away.
Sweet. Actually, funny you keep pointing at me because this is all about Nick. This is all about the cadets. They really drove this. I'm just the kind of the Gandalf figure, pulling on my beard and just mentoring them. But this is really their
You're
show.
the one that showed up on my screen, so.
Yeah, sweet. Yeah, I guess I'll start it by saying that it's a pleasure to be here. I'm glad that I met Cadet Kauza, and that we had this opportunity to present the work they did last year, and then carrying over now through this semester as well. So, take it away, Nick.
All right, yeah, like I said, really excited to be here. Very appreciative of it. Really wouldn't have been here without Dr. Fielder's mentorship and guidance, and kind of putting our two heads together on this and making it happen, and end up being a really good exercise that we were able to execute together. So we'll just get right into it. So initially we made our connection through CSU, where I attend, and Dr. Fielder is a professor there. Ended up meeting through his intro level political science 131 class, and I think it was comparative world governments, something like that. And one of the things we did was interesting was we actually ended up doing a wargaming class, and that I was already starting to kind of get into wargaming, looking at finding out what the niche is about and how I could use it to, for training or just a way to apply it or get into it. And really was able to combine what I wanted to do with Pigeon's ultimate vision, which you can speak more to.
Cool. So I'll say up front, Nick has my absolute blessing and almost like a, how should I say, demand that I said, please just call me Pigeon. Don't always be calling me Colonel Fielder or Dr. Fielder, because that makes me grow more gray whiskers. And I found that about 90% of the time he just calls me Pigeon, but no matter what else I do, 5% of the time it's Dr. Fielder and 5% it's Lieutenant Colonel Fielder. I mean, look at me. Do I look like a Lieutenant Colonel? I walk around campus in flip-flops and shorts now. It's great. So yes, anyway, poor Cadet Kauza here had the misfortune of having me in class twice as his professor for a kernel of problems and comparative authoritarianism. And if I remember correctly, we did the large classroom game in 131 where I was running it in Discord and whatnot, and you were like, this is nuts. It comes up, strikes up conversations. Nick's kind of selling himself short a little bit here. He actually came with a pretty good repertoire of gaming under his belt, a variety of different board games, role-playing games, war games, all the way from, yes, we're going to make fun of Risk and a little bit, all the way to, he already knew about the Battle for North Africa game, so I had to make sure to put a picture of that in here as well. But yeah, I like running games in class. If you've ever seen me talk before, I'm, as far as I know, the only political scientist in the discipline who researches emergent political behavior inside game worlds. And I use games both as natural experiments and in class to test course concepts. So that picture right there is from my other class, Comparative Authoritarianism. Nick wasn't in this game, unfortunately, where at the end of the class, they had to fight a pandemic that didn't age well, playing different types of regimes, and they had to play to the type of regime, and that the way they can kind of embody what it was like, what it's like to make decisions as that type, anywhere from a totalitarian state to a democratically disguised dictatorship. So this was fall of 2019, and yeah, what happens in March of 2020? Well, sometimes truth is stranger than fiction when it comes to putting together games, and we'll actually have more on that later. So yeah, we Nick came back to me and said, I want to stand up an actual wargaming club, and that club then segued into, I want to use this, what we're learning in the wing. And that was fantastic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Now I'll just turn it back over to Nick.
Awesome. Yeah, no, that leads perfectly into just kind of how we got it started up. So like Pigeon said, it was the two of us kind of together at first, figuring out what to do. Also with who's like my number 2 guy, then Cadet, now Lieutenant Ortega. Just kind of the three of us running together, putting the framework of the club together, getting it stood up and recognized by the university. We decided from early on we wanted to have this be a student-run organization, so it was a non like ROTC. Oh, by the way, anything I say is a personal opinion, does not reflect my views or opinions of the Department of Defense or the Air Force. But everything there, we decided we thought we might have more leeway, creative freedom, ability to pursue games in the way that we wanted to as a club, with Pigeon as our advisor, myself as president, and Ortega as kind of number 2, helping run a lot of the admin stuff. And then we had Cadet Mount, who ended up being our kind of on the ground subject matter expert. When we wanted to kind of grind something out, he was always there to help out and help make sure that like any packets or maps or things that needed to be dished out or, you know, tuned, he was there. So, but because we wanted to have this be a civilian club working for an ROTC wing, we were in regular meetings with our former commander, Colonel Childress, and our current commander, Colonel Johnson, and talking about what objectives we would be hitting, what our vision was to bring to the wing to help train these cadets, and so yeah, just kind of how our structure ran. So we were able to do a lot with that. So we started out at first, at the very beginning of the club, just playing Risk, as you know, Pigeon talked about a little bit earlier. Using at first just playing normal Risk games. You know, you draw cards, take territories, but then we changed it to geopolitical stuff, having, you know, the greens and the blues be America and Europe, and they were fighting global war and trying to, you know, take Australia as a Chinese-Russian coalition was going after them. And then we would add sea routes, we would add diplomacy, we would add other things to make the game feel more real or dynamic, bigger than just Risk. So we were able to really use that to kind of get a basic framework for the club of how dynamic a war game can be, and how we can take something as simple as Risk and really test its versatility and make totally different games out of those tools that it provided. From there, then we started to work on other games like Fire in the Lake, which Vanny, you played. It took us like 5 people over 3 days to set up in our house, and then several days of playing and trying to figure it out. We played a little bit of Pandemic. We played some Shores of Tripoli, and really, you know, when we say deconstruct the games, what we're talking about is having people play it, and then almost like a white cell or an observer, you're watching the mechanics at work. And why do they work? Why are certain things easier to set up? Why are things more specific or complicated in Fire in the Lake? Whereas in Shores of Tripoli, it's telling you the same story of, you know, historical asymmetric warfare, but with way less instructions. You know, one takes 3 days to set up, one takes 20 minutes. And really understanding, well, why does that work? How does that work? And then how can we then take those mechanics that we're learning and observing and seeing and transferring it to then our own training, to make, like I said, our own wing level game. You know, short of buying 30 Risk boards, what can we do to make our own thing out of these mechanics that we're finding that are sophisticated enough to be, you know, versatile and work in multiple areas, but simple enough to understand that people can just pick up the game and start playing it. Is there anything you want to add, Pigeon?
Yes. So I know if like I went to Historicon and I stood in the middle of the convention hall and I shouted "Risk," there's a chance that everyone would try to kill me with counter cards and whatnot. But you know what I really like about Risk as a starting point is it's really easy to teach someone how to play it, and it's really easy to modify. So it makes it easy for if someone wants to start thinking through how would I repurpose this, because a lot of professional game design is like kind of repurposing mechanics to meet the objectives you're trying to measure. It's certainly a lot easier than even going to a next level like Axis and Allies, or dare I say, whipping out the campaign for North Africa, which, if I remember correctly, takes 1,600 hours to play, and I don't think the designer has actually ever finished playing it either. That sort of thing. We also, I encourage them to think about wargaming writ large, like not just some like Advanced Squad Leader, not just the Avalon Hill back catalog or the GMT Games back catalog, but like if I wanted to think in terms of you're tasked with an objective that you're trying to measure, what mechanics are going to help you do that? So is Pandemic a war game? Not by like a hard and fast definition, no. But like they could look at Castle Panic. They could look at what other games could they look at? Battle for Greyport, Red Dragon Inn, like games that are nowhere near the definition of war games, but because it would have a mechanic that worked to meet their objective. And I think that's what I have here. Yep.
Awesome. So when we decided we wanted to make a wing level exercise, first we kind of had to start with our meta. What were we trying to accomplish? What was the framework or foundation of the world that we wanted to build and have the players, live and work in? So we decided we wanted it to be a test of their leadership. What things about a cadet's leadership do we want to look at or stress or strain or test and see what happens from a club perspective, what we wanted to do. And then we set our goals to meet our hard objectives, which for Air Force ROTC, there's a document called Volume 1, and Objective 10 is all about wargaming. So we had, in one hand, our club's vision that we had where we wanted to test a cadet's leadership in samples of behavior we'll get into later, versus going hand in hand with the objectives that were laid out by Air Force ROTC National Command that a cadet has to hit. And we found that we're not doing this. As far to the best of our knowledge, we're the only detachment that is fulfilling these objectives. And so we saw that we weren't hitting objectives, and then tried to think of, well, what can we do to fix this? What can we do to start hitting these objectives and finding that solution? Big thing for us on kind of overcoming that, because we haven't been going after wargaming in a coordinated way nationally. From what we observed, a lot of people don't know what wargaming is, or kind of see what it is and think they understand it, but don't have a knowledge of the applications of it. Like how in the real Air Force there's like Operation Red Flag, which you have real fighter jets and real cars and guns going around in the desert at Nellis Air Force Base. And so trying to tell your peers that this is important when they don't see it. You're trying to convince a 21 credit mechanical engineering major that they should spend several hours out of their week to build this game in a theoretical world that they might not understand. Another thing is securing top level buy-in, getting your boss or your commander to understand that this is a good thing, and framing it to them that their response to what you present them should be, why aren't we doing this already? Let's start doing it right now. Saying that there are objectives that we're missing that we need to hit. These are great ways to test someone's leadership. So anything on that, Pigeon?
Yeah, I wanted to add to the combating the ignorance of the function of wargaming. Like when I'm out there thumping Peter Pearl like an old country preacher, I usually run into two types of audience. The first audience is the the group that they know what wargaming is. It excites them, and like, yes, we can do this. We get to, yes, it should be fun, but we're actually going to learn something from it, and that learning is going to carry over into our operational mindset. The other audience are the people who say, "Oh, you mean like we're going to be playing Monopoly or something like that? Like, what the hell are we supposed to get out of that?" And we go, first, no, Monopoly is a terrible game because you only have to roll a 7 consistently to win. And 2, and it's more than that. I'm actually going to go into more detail about how the psychology of gaming, like in the next slide or so. But that second group, until they've actually gone through it, until they have eaten the green eggs and ham, it's like they have to do it to understand why it works. You have to then overcome that hesitancy. That's what makes that top level buy-in really, really important. If you don't have, military, you have the senior commander. If you're in a corporation, you don't have someone in the C-suite. You don't have someone who says, not only we're going to do this, but they're excited about it and it's infectious and they're actually making people excited to do it. It'll die on the vine. It'll absolutely die on the vine. No one will want to participate. They won't see the value in it. So they say, if the boss doesn't care, then why should I care about it? And then, I'll let Nick pick up on the verisimilitude, unless you want me to just run with it.
Yeah, go for it.
All right, sweet. Something when I gave a presentation to both the Air Force ROTC and the Army ROTC about wargaming and how wargaming works. And something I brought up was the idea of verisimilitude, or that it feels real. Like the scenario might not be realistic, but it's plausible. This is particularly important in my mind for a professional wargame, where you're actually trying to get learning out of it that will have applications outside of the game in your work areas. So, like, you want it to be coherent, you want it to be consistent, and you want someone's diving for cover, and Nick will be talking more about this later. When they're diving for cover in the game, like, it's not let's pretend, it's not haha we're just playing, but they feel like I'm actually being attacked by somebody, or this could happen in real life if I don't take this seriously. And this is where now I'll turn it over to Nick for the truth is stranger than fiction in terms of putting this together.
Yeah, exactly. Our stuff we were talking about, because we're Air Force ROTC, a lot of the stuff that we are trained to face is, building your team, leading your team, and a lot of it is logistics and acquisition based, because that's a lot of what the Air Force does. It's how can you support the guy on the ground with the rifle, and that's what the Air Force is centered around. How do you get them food, water, ammunition, fighter cover, anything like that they might need to fight and win. And so we decided to do our war game based on what were then current events of a military buildup in Eastern Europe going on. And so we wanted it to be around an Air Force operation of flying in munitions and food into a besieged country. And as we were doing this at the time, we were drawing on the then pending invasion of Ukraine, and looking at, well, what might happen? What would the Air Force do then if we were going to do a Congress-approved airlift in country? And what tools would we be using? Where would they be coming from? And so using real-world issues to draw inspiration into our fake world, so that our players could then move however fast or slow, left or right, that they wanted to, within the fake countries that we made. But they were able to have real buy-in because it was based in real issues that they could see happening in front of them. And just real quick before we go forward, because I think I mentioned them before, but to put faces to the names, and the slide here, the top left is Cadet Mount, Cadet Crook. The bottom right is Lieutenant Ortega. Bottom left is Cadet Alwa, and then bottom center is myself. And so these are all the members of the club who helped build that first game and get it off the ground. I mentioned this slide before. So just to put names to those faces. Awesome. So a big thing for us was the role-playing game elements and a suspension of disbelief. So you want to start off, Pigeon?
Yes. So yeah, they made a conscious decision to say yes, this is going to be a war game, but it was leaning more on narrative as opposed to hard Kriegspiel. And now, I know Merle's heard this a million times, but I'm going to say it again. The brief description on how games work, from a role-playing game even to just playing a board game with your family during a spring break or something like that. The concepts of liminality and the concept of symbolic correspondence. So you'll hear liminality referred to also as the magic circle. Peter Perl will call it presence. And in virtual reality, Dr. Perl will call it synthetic experience, excuse me. And in virtual reality, it's called presence, or that idea that you're injecting your persona, your person into the game space, into the avatar. So what liminality is, the idea that it comes from studies by Victor Turner, Johann Huizinga, looking not just at games, but also at religious ritual, that you go into either the temple or onto the games, like the football field. The moment you cross into field, you've crossed into this new reality. You've crossed that threshold, the liminal state, so that everything that you do on the field is now real to you, and everything outside of the field no longer is real. So an outside observer seeing people fighting over a ball or trying to conquer a dragon, or, do airlift into a country, will say, well, what are they getting out of that? For the folks inside, done well, it feels like they're actually doing it. It feels like they're actually doing it, that they're going to fight tooth and nail to get that ball across the field. They will fight all week, arguing with each other, trying to cooperate to make sure that airlift gets somewhere else on time. It's basically, it feels real, but it's risk-free. The idea then is, when you come out of the liminal state, everything you've learned sticks with you. Hence why people will remember games that they played in the 70s with crystal clear clarity, and remember the triumph of beating their opponent or overcoming the obstacle. But then they can't remember what they had for lunch the day before, because they were basically in a temple. They had a religious experience playing the game. And I know this sounds like I'm going crazy philosophy here, but I kid you not, that's how it works. The next element is symbolic correspondence, and that comes from animist, a religion where the the ritual performer might don the skin of an animal, or the mask of an animal, or the carved mask of a demon, or I'm using Christian mythology here, but I'll run with a demon or devil or something like that. For those participating in that ritual, they aren't pretending to wear the skin of the fox. They aren't pretending to be a demon. They become it. So, and everyone in the ritual believes. So for that moment in time, that person is a fox. That person is a spirit. And everybody sees the spirit. Now, fast forward to the 21st century, someone's going to say, we don't have animist religion anymore. We don't do that. And to which I would reply, riddle me this. You go to work wearing a suit. You go to a concert wearing your favorite band shirt. Or dare I say, you go to a football game painted up like a marmot or something like that. That's symbolic correspondence. You're embodying some sort of character. You're becoming something else, and you're not pretending you are that item. So in professional wargame parlance, this is the idea that if you want to train someone to become a sergeant, train someone to become a captain, you have them put on the skin of the sergeant or the skin of the captain, hopefully not the real skin, if you will. And they learn to embody what it feels like. And more often than not, it helps them break out and, like they say, I am the sergeant now, or I am the captain now. So when they walk out of the liminal state, their mindset is now on, how do I lead? How do I get promoted? And how do I think about, everyone's staring me uncomfortably, like try to think of the right metaphor. Basically, they're thinking bigger than how they thought before they came into the circle to train. All right, there you go.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of going off of that, we have kind of off to the right is some examples that we use for story building tools. Like on the top right was something that we put as our initial like framework as a club, so that when we were building the game, building the world, we understood kind of what was the world that we were building. What were we going to do that said, okay, no, this needs to be more intensified, or this is too out of world. We can't include this. And like none of in the bottom third where it says inject list, like none of those injects eventually made it through because it didn't fit with our story. It didn't fit with the world to make it believable for what we wanted them to do. And Pigeon was talking about, you're putting on the animal skin. Ours for that was having them wear their uniforms, and then they were handed, folders that said top secret, kind of like in the ones that's in the bottom right. They say exercise and training only on them, obviously, because they're not real, but they still believe in their head, the monkey part of their brain is telling them this is a top secret document. No foreign government can look at this. This was entrusted to me. And it pushes them over that edge into that liminal space. And so for us, for this specific game, we wanted it to be narrative driven. So they weren't going to be fighting an opponent, but they were going to be trying to solve a difficult and evolving problem like in the real world. But we had to make sure it wasn't narrative centric. And the difference in that is the narrative was the loose timeline. Like you think of it like a large highway. The narrative is the left and right guardrails, but the players themselves could choose what lane they wanted to be in, how fast or slow they wanted to go. It was all up to them because they were all acting within that one narrative. And all of that wraps into our multi-sensory, or kind of how I dubbed it, of shaping the battlefield, because in there we wanted them to be in uniform. We had them in certain groups, and those certain groups sat in different areas of a lecture hall that we were familiar with. And so we were able to create a space where you had a bunch of people in uniform running around with documents that have fake top secret on them, and we're able to really believe that they were in an operations center. They didn't care about the group sitting 2 rows behind them. They were just focused on their group. It was just white noise to them. Everyone was able to have a high investment and a high yield from that experience of being able to fully dive in, and then when they reemerged out of the game, learning a lot. And so kind of to underscore that, this was a picture taken about halfway through. We had a 1-hour execution of the game itself, and we decided to have a countdown clock so that if the players started to slow up or lose their pace or get out of world a little bit, they would look up and just see, oh, that just wasted me 10 minutes, or I only have 34 minutes left. And it would kind of push them back into the world and keep them in the space that we had made for them to stay focused, on task, and in character, so to speak. So as you can see, no one is looking at the other groups. All of them are focused inwards at their own groups, which is exactly what we wanted to design and make and have happen. So for the vision and objectives, the biggest thing, and this is something that Pigeon taught me directly, was always make sure that you start with it and that it's always able for your people to see. Because if they can't see what your vision is by writing it out, if you just keep it in your head, no one else is going to be able to stay in step with you. You're just going to be walking forward alone, and they can't support you in the way that you want or need them to. And so every single meeting, I would always immediately write up in the top of the board what the vision was, and it would just reinforce it every time. Because then if I wasn't talking to a group, all the group member had to do was look up, see it was written on the board, and then say, oh, I know what I need to do. This is still in line with that, or it's not in line with that. I'll adjust it, without me ever having to talk to them. And it just kept the process moving. A big part, I said earlier, how we had our vision as a club, but we also had our own objectives that we had to hit, and they had to be measurable. And we decided, we created a list of samples of behavior, and we have an example of that on the right-hand side of the slide that we created based on leadership criteria that we are taught and teach to the underclassmen in Air Force ROTC. so that we could say as a club, this is what we're looking for. How does this game support that? Talking about that meta that we created. Additionally to the objectives, we had our AFROTC Volume 1 that I discussed. And in there were 4 objectives. I put the first 2 on here, talking about the game had to show cadets how the Air Force employs assets in a fight and how we contribute to the overall joint fight. So whether it's to, a humanitarian crisis on the ground, or giving, fighter cover to airlift in Rangers or something. But additionally, not copied on here is about another 2-page document of other leadership or objectives in that specific Volume 1 document that can be tied to Wargame, the Wargame we made, or Wargaming in general. So never worry about if there's not enough to measure it against. You can always find a way to keep it tangible, keep it measurable, and stay within your SMART goal that you've put. Another big part is keep it in the scope of your vision. We had all kinds of injects set up and all kinds of timetables, and we could have run this game for 5 to 6 hours easily and let them, struggle through every bit of it. But within the scope of our vision for this specific game, we had a total of 90 minutes of execution and an hour of game time. So you need to make sure that your want to create a very large, in-depth game doesn't carry away your team. Not letting the theme of the excitement of what they're going to be doing take control. Keeping it driven by the theme, but not centered wholly around it, because then that's where you can start getting into really niche mechanics that only you understand, or people start not understanding the story anymore and not wondering if it's still in the vision or your objectives. So always make sure that you check what you're making as you're making it with your team. And as you are, don't be afraid to cut. During this specific process, we cut pages of content several times, all the way up until like a week before execution. We were checking over documents, polishing documents, tuning maps, cutting paragraphs at a time to make sure that it fit within the scope of what we wanted to execute, understanding, the limitations of the deadline we had with, the creative freedom that we had been granted to actually execute this. So anything you'd like to add, Pigeon?
Yes. I want to stay on the slide. I have a reattack from the previous slide, but I want to use this portion as the case study, if you will. If you remember from the previous slide, you talked about being narrative driven, but narrative centric. So it did have Kriegspiel mechanics. It did have rules. Hold that thought. And also go back to the multi-sensory experience. I'll address that as well. So the rules. What the team was worried about was that if it was too dependent on narrative, then people couldn't fail. They could just simply talk their way out of a situation. Now, you certainly can do that. Is certainly an option for different types of games, but they had to have a sense that there was risk, and that if with risk, you had to feel like you can fail, and failure must have costs. This actually ties into a good friend of mine, Sean Patrick Fannin, a game designer. His assessment, and I agree with him, was that a role-playing game should always have some sort of mechanical measurement of chance, because if there's no chance, then there's no risk, and people have to feel like that they can fail in some way. So they did create a number of different mechanics where the players here were fundamentally talking about things, but if they mismeasured, for example, how many aircraft they needed for a certain bed down, and then they arrive to the location and they don't have the airlift, okay, what are you going to do now? Now you're at a risk of actually failing your objective. And then the multi-sensory experience. So another conscious decision the club made was, it's really been all pen and paper games up to this point. We've talked about Vassal and we've talked about Tabletop Simulator, but they've all deconstructed pen and paper games. Okay, where was I? There we go.
Apologies, issue on my end.
Oh, no worries. Hopefully I didn't miss something important there. All right, so what was I saying? Okay, so I made a conscious decision to be pen and paper. One, because I'm going to put words into Nick's mouth. We couldn't afford to put a copy of Arma 3 on everyone's computer, but 2, pen and paper, you can just sit down and play. Yeah, it might take forever to set up, but I mean, so the act of like handling dice, touching cards, looking at the map, or carrying around those training top secret documents, like, oh, this is mine now. I can't let anyone touch it. Compare that to typing on a screen, that sort of thing. So given that, and then knowing they only had 90 minutes, they had to make the sensory experience, the sensory feeling drive the cadets to feel like that they were running out of time, that if they didn't do things right, they were going to lose. So Nick already cited the clock counting down. I love how he said, I don't want it counting up, because then it gives a sense that we have more time. No, it's counting down. You're losing time. In an uncomfortable room with all those chairs, the room's familiar, but they have to navigate around it. Lights are all bright. Even though they're in their own niches, you can still hear all this cacophony around you of people talking. So it becomes tense, becomes, how should I say, a sense of being otherworldly, and that taps into liminality. So it transports the people's minds into another place. So the game becomes, again, it's risk-free, but it feels real. And that's what I got there.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of keeping it in part of our vision was it being a high stress but low risk environment. So perfect. Anything on this one?
I'm good.
Awesome. So kind of the next phase that we went into then was building the game, actually play testing it, and doing some dry runs ourselves. And so kind of direct your attention to the bottom right of the screen. That was our initial setup of the game. Everything from there that we developed could be directly traced like a route back to that picture, where the fancy folders that say Commander, Intel, LGR, and Ops all tie to that blue organization chart, and knowing what's the minimum number of people and what's the maximum amount of people so that everyone has a role. You know, what are our own left and rights that we need to create to have a successful mission. Everything could be changed and adapted, abstracted or quantified however we wanted to, because we set up a very comprehensive foundation. If you look at the blue circles with the red lines between them, those were our airlift routes, and we had a dotted line indicating that you would need support and fighter coverage past that. You know, that later translated to our sophisticated, area of operations map on the left-hand side, where we have from different bases, air corridors, drop zone, insignias, more of a liminal, real world looking map that you would actually receive. So that we as a club were able to create this, and figuring out, well, how much supplies can these planes carry? How much do we want them to take? A level 1, 2, or 3 runway just can mean anything we want it to mean. A level 1, 2, or 3 cargo plane can mean whatever we want it to be to serve our needs. We can then dress it up as a C-130, C-17, C-5, but at the end of it, we could always bring it back down to a level 1, 2, or 3 plane to keep it simple and clean and cohesive from a builder's and a play testing perspective. At first, when we ran our first successful iteration of the game, it was just C-130, C-5s, and C-17s, and then we addressed numbers issue for cargo carrying or number of planes necessary to actually complete the mission, and then how do we adjust things left and right. Our goal was to set it up so that they're moving down the field, and then right when they're 10 yards away from the goalpost, we move it another 10 yards. How do we create that feeling for a full hour for people creating and organizing an airlift? And each play test, we were able to get better data and just completely fine tune it more. But it all came back to the fact that we had laid such a comprehensive foundation beforehand. It really helped set us up for success and helped set up the players for a smooth transition into the game itself. Anything, Pigeon?
Yes, this is a perfect example of the importance of the objective. So a cynic might walk in and look at the board there and say, what is this? What are they learning about airlift from this? To which I would reply, this isn't a one-for-one recreation of airlift. This is the objective of this game is to test decision-making and communication. So all the mechanics and the way the course of play is all designed to feed back into what that objective is. Can you communicate effectively, and are you able to command effectively? That's all it. So you'll find then, if you understand your objective really well, the mechanics can be very, very abstract. So this is certainly, looking at this on the board, is very, very abstract. This is also a good point to reiterate from the previous slide where Nick said, do not be afraid to cut and always make sure it feeds back into the mission. Because I remember standing in front of this board, remember as that mentor figure, just nodding wisely at the right place at the right time, when I could see the team trying to debate different mechanics they might throw in. And more often than not, it would be Nick who said, does that contribute back to the objective? If not, we don't have the time to do it. We do not, it's not gonna, they're not getting a learning out of it, and we only have 90 minutes. So it was a pleasure to watch, I'll put it that way. That's what I got.
Yeah, awesome. So for the actual execution, when that happened, we had it set up so that we wanted to just start the clock and then let the players go. Again, the idea of setting up that, left and right guardrail, and then they got to pick how fast they moved, where they moved, and what they were going to do, and just letting it be fully immersed in the game. We had the players who were following the schedule that we had pre-set up of, you have 1 hour to plan this airlift, and at the end of it, you have to say, are you successful? Did you successfully plan this airlift? Can we execute? Or no, we're going to have to hold off on the airlift. We're not ready to go yet. And we had different injects. We had different time tables to keep, but everyone knew what was going on from a white cell perspective. And by white cell is anyone that was a non-player. And so that was upperclassmen who were either the builder white cells, which were Wargaming Club members, who were going around the room helping answer questions or put out any fires as they came up, just to make sure we had as smooth running as possible. And then white cell evaluators who had a standardized fleet form that were watching the group leaders. Like I said, we were testing their leadership skills. And so we had an upperclassman attached to the underclassmen who could then watch them and give specific feedback on how they did in their specific scenario. And so then the players would then get something out of it. They would learn, they would, like I said, test their leadership, test their flexibility, test their adaptability. We had cadre who were involved, which are our training staff or commissioned officers. And they would go around the room and act as like spies, posing threats to operational security. And part of the consequences that Pigeon had mentioned earlier was that, say, like a cadre member had grabbed a piece of paper that said top secret on it that you had turned away from on your desk, and they handed it to, say, myself or another white cell, they would then have consequences. Like we would say, you have to reshuffle this, or day one has to be reworked now because all of your flight plans got canceled because it got leaked, or there's a comms breach, you can't talk for 2 minutes now. And in a game where time is of the essence and it's very centered around your ability to work within the set timetable, that's a killer. And people adapted very quickly to that and had a lot of learning from there. Like I said, we had an hour of actual game time execution and a total of 90 minutes for in brief, the game, and then our debrief. So we had an hour and a half of execution, but the development of this took at minimum 350 hours with the club members, and anywhere north of 500 unconfirmed hours of people just in between classes or after homework or after physical training of just hopping on the document and reading for a couple hours or doing a grammar check or moving the maps into a correct position or doing a page check, printing, putting the files all together. There was a lot of development that ended up going into this. And so it's a real iceberg if you're not ready for it. The players only saw an hour to an hour and a half, but the club was months from January to when we executed. And so that was something that we adjusted to and flex with. And anyone else wanting to do this, that's something to, I think, be aware of. So anything, Pigeon?
Yeah. I got a few things here. All
Absolutely.
good, except I got a funny story about Nick towards the end. So I like how Nick was referring to guardrails, like what are the boundaries of the game. So I want to note the difference between a guardrail and the difference between a railroad. So railroads are bad. That is in a professional game where the design of the game is forcing the players to a specific conclusion and they can't deviate. Ultimately, that's going to leave the players grossly dissatisfied. But in contrast, a guardrail is informing the players at least of the boundaries of the game. Like your liminal space is in here. Like you really can't do this one thing, you can't do that the other, but otherwise you have all this free room in the center to try to achieve your objective. I think I'm defining this correctly. It was Dr. Ian Bogost at Georgia Institute of Technology. He calls it procedural rhetoric, or the idea is that the game designer creates in the actual rules of the game creates the guardrails in which the player learns to navigate. And if done right, they accept it. The players will accept that, okay, I know this is the sandbox I can play in. But man, never ever just drive the players in a professional game to a specific conclusion. That's not what a war game is intended for. We also, as it got to this point, we talked quite a bit about adjudication, facilitation, the different differences between like the white cell, if you wanted to have a red team. I'll get into all this in a second. If you take the Moore's Wargame certification course, they have a number of lessons on adjudication and facilitation, i.e. like how do you interpret the rules and how do you like manage the people? When I say manage, I'm like reading the room, mentoring them, talking to them. This game ran so fast and so intense. The game basically ran itself, but they weren't really wearing a facilitator hat during the actual gameplay. They were almost just invisible in the room, if you will. What they did is they put their facilitator hat on during the debrief, not during the actual game. And something they definitely wanted to avoid is the concept of red teaming, where that would be like if a referee comes in and is actually adversarial, like coming in and trying to pick you apart, trying to be your opponent. I'm kind of simplifying it here in a way, but they said, no, we're very hands off. We don't want to give a hint of what they should be doing or should not be doing. Let the game run itself, if you will. Oh yeah, and what sadly though, I actually missed this. I missed it. I was at a conference in Chicago when this kicked off. I like wept openly when I found out it was scheduled, and I already knew I was going to Chicago for a conference. Another thing is, oh yeah, we talk about all the hours that go into this. I remember I'm pretty flexible and forgiving in class, but I could not fail to notice during class that Nick was working on a map. And I said, Nick, what are you doing in my classroom? Without missing a beat, working on a map for the war game, sir. Like, carry on. What can I do? What can I do? Yeah, it was a lot, but it's like, yes, this is a lot of work. It is a lot of work. And what I want to add here is it's not just the hours. The game is a leadership laboratory, but the act of building it is also a leadership laboratory. All these individuals with all these moving parts, all trying to work together to create this one game. So, Nick got a sense on how to command. People learn more about themselves. Like, hey, I'm pretty good at graphics. I'll make the map. I'm pretty good at mathematics. I can run the mechanics and so on. So people, even if they just have a small part of the design, they learn just that much more about themselves and what they're capable of. All right. That's what I have for this one.
Awesome. And so kind of the next step in the process that you want to make sure you hit, that we definitely hit afterwards, was the after action report. You need to always do this, and you don't always have to go back and read it like every single month, but you need to make sure that you're staying current so that you're not walking into the same traps that you walked into 6 months, a year, 2 years ago, or whenever you leave that position, the person coming in has a better starting place than where you left it. The big thing for us as a first time war game exercise and as a ROTC detachment was, like I said earlier, not having a thinking opponent. So when you don't have a thinking opponent, how do you force the players to outthink the game? How do you make it so it's the game that they're fighting, not another person, and you make it feel real for them? We had our own, so in the schedule you saw, there was a debrief that was for the players with their evaluators. Afterwards, at this next club meeting, we had our own feedback within the club that we then transcribed and put in like our drive that we had to set this up for next time, so that we were ready to go whenever we needed to do this again. And from there too, people kept remarking all last semester, even 6 months later now into this semester, about how much fun they had doing that and that they remembered it and why they chose what they did. And so, when you have that positive feedback already, what do you do to enhance it? Not just from a perspective of the game where you're enhancing your mechanics and maybe adding a red team, but as a white cell, as a facilitator or as a guardrail, what do you do to make that better for those players and to make it a better, more streamlined and efficient experience for you as you're creating this? And Pigeon, you want to take this one?
Yeah, where do I want to start here? So, yeah, starting at the top, I run after action reports even during an entertainment one-shot game at a gaming convention. At the very end, wrap up the game. I look around the table, the people played. I said, "What do you think? Do you have any feedback for me? Did anything bother you? Did anything trouble you?" In a one shot for entertainment, it's not that huge of a deal, but it helps me improve my game, and I want to make sure the players walk away satisfied. But the worst thing that can happen, like if you don't do a proper debrief, both for professional or entertainment, is you get a problem with bleed. That is the concept of bleed, and it comes from actually theater, someone bleeding for their part. This is where someone comes into the game space. Either they make a mistake in the game and everyone blames them for it, or they actually get angry at somebody else inside the liminal space playing the game, and then when they cross back out of it, they're still angry at that person, or the person is still being punished. Like, oh, that Cadet Kauza, no, Tyler Ortega's here, I'm going to pick fun of him. Lieutenant Ortega clearly screwed up with that airlift. He's obviously not a good leader. He's got some sort of character flaw, and we can't trust him outside of the game. No. I've actually seen that happen. Seeing someone make a mistake in a game, and then people end up punishing them for it when they go back to their work areas. The game should be risk-free. Let people take risks and make mistakes. That's where you're supposed to do it. There's also instances where it's not just the sense that someone has a character flaw, but there could also be anger. Like two players get angry at each other in a war game, and they come out of it and they're still angry at each other. And that anger keeps festering. That's the bleed part. Like it's bleeding over into their real life. And a good after action report, a good debrief, you're getting all this data, but you're also nipping all those kind of interpersonal things in the bud. Take the good out of the magic circle, take the learning out, and leave all the negative stuff behind. That's what you want to do.
Exactly. And just kind of moving forward with that after action report, I call it the reality check of you could start if you start getting into a, tit for tat, this or that. Even in your after action report, you can always say like, oh, well, this would have been better if, so and so had just gone with the plan or something like that. You just kind of bring it back to reality and say, well, okay, like, did we have fun building it and executing it? Did the players have fun? Did we meet our objectives and vision? Because it's important to hit, I think, all three of those, because you can have fun and, hit the vision, but did it really meet the objectives? And if you don't meet the objectives, you never met your baseline criteria. And if you meet your vision and your objectives, but you didn't have fun building it, or your team didn't have fun building it, they're not going to put the effort that they would if they're not excited about it, that they're not bought into it. And if they're not bought into it, the players are going to get a product that reflects that, which then circles all the way back to you and your team. So it's always important, I think, to make sure that, as challenging, dynamic, frustrating as it might be, that it's always a healthy frustration, that it's because you're all working together to solve a problem, not butting heads, that it's all of you moving forward together. And I think that's a crucial part of any after action report. In this one specifically, we decided from here, okay, this went pretty well. What can we do next time? Maybe we introduce a thinking opponent. Maybe we add, real-time moving units. Maybe we do something different. Maybe we do a similar exercise, but in a different setting. And so that kind of helped carry us forward. And so our kind of key takeaways that we took from this was, you need to set your vision and objectives from the beginning and stick to them and believe in what you set up. Because if you don't stick to your vision, you don't stick to your objectives, you're not going to hit the bar. And if you don't have faith in your vision or the objectives that you've set, you're also not going to hit the bar, or you might come in, below and not even have a game because you didn't stick to what you were going to do. You got to be prepared to put in extra work. That was our first game that we ran. And like I said, it took anywhere between 300 to 600 hours of club time to make, club members donating their time, coming to extra meetings, staying up late and doing, grammatical checks and checking for formatting issues. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and you've got to be ready to do that. Another big one is supporting your team so that they can support you. The way that we had the leadership set up was that as soon as, it didn't matter that I was like the club president, or that, I had the vision, or I was meeting with Colonel, at the end of it, by the time we hit execution and the builder white cells were moving around, making sure everything was okay, every single club member could give the same and as good answer as I could to anyone. And so we all were completely in step, completely unified, and completely seamless in our execution. But that was because during the development phase, like Cadet Awa was, crushing numbers and figuring out ratios for cargo planes to actual cargo. And I would come to him and say, hey, how's this stuff going? And he would say, oh, this is the supply number we're at. I think we're going to need more fighters. And then I would go to, Lieutenant Ortega and say, hey, I think you're going to have to up the fighter numbers. We're going to have more cargo planes because there's more cargo. And then he would start adapting that, and talking with Cadet Mount, saying, hey, do these roles still work if we need to, trim up or trim down aircraft levels? And so each of them had their piece of the puzzle that they were able to completely focus on, because they had placed their trust in me to kind of be a jack of all trades, master of none, where I could walk around to each of them and give them the information they needed to stay in step, so that when we finally all put the pieces together and started our play testing and our dry run all the way up to execution, everyone who was building the game knew what the other people had done, because they saw how their part contributed to the other 2, 3, or 4. And so it didn't matter if it was me answering a question, or Cadet Awa, or Cadet Mount, or Lieutenant Ortega. All of us knew what would need to happen no matter what would come up. Another key thing is to create buy-in. buy-in cannot be underscored enough. As I said at first, we were facing a lot of resistance of, well, why do we need to do this? At first, it was, I know we have an objective we need to hit, but we haven't hit it before and we're doing fine. How do you break out of that status quo? And to give a recent example, our cadet wing leadership made an announcement the day of our wargame this semester, underscoring just how important this is, how important wargaming is to training and to the Air Force. The week before that, in the picture is our commander, Colonel Johnson. The week before, Colonel Johnson had made an announcement to the entire unit saying, hey, this is important, this training is valuable, you need to pay attention to this and, find ways to also contribute to this, talking about war games that he had been experienced in, between India and Pakistan for 3 days and what that was like and why it's important. And so that trickles down then, because then the cadets who will be your players see the buy-in, they see the reason now. The commander points in the direction to go and the unit is supposed to follow with that. And so if you have that top level buy-in, that creates a more friendly environment for you to introduce these new things, these new elements and exercises that fall in line with these objectives and really help out your detachment. And then making sure you write down your after action report and follow up on it. You can end your exercise and say, hey, great job, everyone. We write it down, we do all those steps, and then we never look at it. Well, then you're not taking those lessons forward with you. You're taking nothing with you. You want to make sure that you don't walk into the same pitfalls, that you have, contact information maybe, or you have challenges that you ran into last time that you're going to hit this time. Anything you can do to get yourself one more step forward and, set yourself up for success. And a big part of that is taking what you learned and getting that positive feedback as well as that constructive feedback and taking that into, 6 months later when you're running your next game or a year for the game after that, because you're not going to remember everything you said in that moment. So, anything else, Pigeon?
I just wanted to really, what's great about this section right here, I don't have much to add, and pretty much because the key takeaways, they're not my takeaways. That it belongs to them. It belongs to the Wargaming Club. It belongs to the detachment. This is what they determined. I mean, man, here I'm the mentor, and I couldn't even make it. The only items I'm going to add here, I do want to foot stomp the whole document and follow up in that the road to professional wargaming hell is filled with debriefs that have been put in a binder, put away, and nobody ever reads them again. And then, like Nick said, a year or two later, we need to build a game, which might have already existed, but everyone forgot about it. Or, hey, we need to test a process, which we've tested. And if we actually put something in place, we wouldn't be having this problem. And we learned that in a previous war game. Basically, the institutional memory dies if you're not following up with your debriefs. But then for my assessment, looking at this, talking to the colonel, talking to the cadets, they nailed it. Evidence that wargaming works. Like, they used a game to immerse themselves to meet an objective. And kind of like I always said with liminality, people will remember games from decades later. Well, it hasn't been decades yet, but the fact they're still talking about it and they're still talking about the outcomes. So now it's reinforcing itself. And that just makes this old pigeon want to hug himself. So that's what I want to say here. Yes.
Absolutely. And these are some of the pictures. This top row of pictures were from the first war game. You can see again, like, everyone is bought in. You have people staring in the distance, laughing, some people in disbelief, exchanging papers. The final set of injects that we had was shortly before the end of the playtime. A missile siren went off and everyone had to duck and cover and get under their desks, but they could keep working. And it was, everyone had become so immersed that people were putting their hands over other people's heads. It's a seminar lecture hall, so they folded up the desks on top of themselves. Our commander, as you see in the top right, took cover with our vice wing commander. while everything was happening, but the work never stopped because people were still bought into it. People were still moving through the objectives and trying to accomplish the mission after, you know, a very intense 50 minutes at that point. And then pictured below was kind of our follow-up, the war game we had this semester where people were able to move units and we had a player versus player environment, and people were able to still get bought in, able to, you know, set up their troops, move around their logistics, talk to a command and intelligence apparatus. And you can see again, like people, different color folders, people, you know, fighting with cards, you know, taking territory, seeing that color flip. It all ties back to the game we ran last year, whereas how do you get them to create that buy-in and, you know, able to take that peak of success and then keep moving forward with it, you know, not just plateau or fall off, but how do you keep on improving on it, you know, making the last game as good or better as the last one. And how do you keep that going in a environment where you might have a low amount of people and a low amount of time for a large unit. So, but overall, we had a resounding success. Our commander was very pleased with it. Everyone had a great time. The white cells loved building it and loved kind of coming together and putting in those hours and putting in the work and eventually seeing the payoff. So, anything you got, Pigeon?
Just that it's not just that the CSU wants to keep doing this, but we'd love to see this happening at more ROTC detachments. Nick and I actually had a pretty long conversation yesterday about the kind of lack of. We just had a conversation about, now I can't think of the right way to put it, a unified effort to actually teach or run war games in Air Force ROTC, at least not that we're aware of. Not that we're aware of. Maybe it is there. Actually, if it is there and you're watching it right now, drop us a line because we want to talk to you.
Absolutely. Yeah, to the best of our knowledge, we're the only detachment that runs war games at the wing level for a, you know, ROTC unit. So if you want to do this and you're not sure how, you know, drop us a line. If you're not Air Force ROTC or not even ROTC, still drop us a line. We'd love to collaborate and communicate and start spreading this.
Ooh.
All right, awesome. I think with that, we can roll into any questions. I can get the chat up. Unless the other Nicholas is going to do that.
So I'm just gonna hop back in here. You know, I'll read out any questions that come up in the chat just so we have them for the sake of the posterity, aka YouTube. But while we're waiting for anybody in the chat to put those, I had a few ones for you just for myself. So I really appreciate all the detail on your guys' development process. My question was with regards to roles and how you assign players to the various different roles. In a lot of war games, that's a very, it's almost an art, you know, just finding the right roles so that you give people the flexibility and have the right subject matter expertise. How did you approach that for your game?
Exactly. We decided that we were going to have, first, our priority was to teach it to underclassmen. And so we wanted it to be sophomores because they were starting to get more of that leadership training. So we knew that the assigned commander of the group that the white cells picked would be a 200 who we wanted to give as much leadership exposure to, and we made as many groups as possible for that. The group composition under that assigned leader, we put with people who they have not had a lot of contact with before, to put them in a as essentially uncomfortable or unknown space as possible, so that they're with people they normally don't work with, normally don't talk to or train with, to encourage their leadership skills to be put to the test. Out of that, the assigned leader from the white cells was able to create their group composition how they saw fit. Again, just a thing of, could they delegate well? Who would they choose? Was up to them. We wanted to give them as much space as possible. The guidelines that we had set up, though, like I said, was a sophomore cadet who we either talked with their individual commanders about it, saying, hey, do you think that this would be a good role for them? What things are you seeing them do? And kind of collected some some qualitative data on the various 200s that we want, or the sophomores that we wanted to fill these roles.
Thanks for the answer. My other question would be, it looks like you're really getting the ball rolling on kind of making multiple iterations of this exercise, this war game, and it looks like just going on these pictures, there's a kind of a major transformation of the game between one iteration and the next. What are some of the really great feedbacks that you got from this most recent time and that you are hoping to carry forward?
Definitely. So from this most recent game, people really enjoyed being able to move their units. So they had to move them on set lines, but being able to set up their units how they wanted to, the fact that there was now a thinking opponent, or you could like quote unquote see the enemy, and you had to use your strategy and thinking and orders that you received to adapt to that. People were able to, as the game progressed, people were still able to be immersed. They were able to have a great time. We still met all of our objectives and stayed with our vision, kind of like how I talked about building upon the last one. This most recent one was, I definitely say, far more aggressive in its development. And so out of that, there was a lot of collaboration that ended up happening within their teams. And so people found different ways to adapt. Instead of like a mechanic that we had was the intelligence had to give the orders from command to the ground commanders. And instead of running back and forth, people started using electronic communications. And so people were still finding new ways to learn, adapt, and overcome various problems they were faced with.
Yeah, we have a question here from Michael, who asks, can you discuss the thought process of whether or not to base the game you create with pen and paper or electronic based, or including more electronic devices at least?
Definitely. We decided pen and paper because, frankly, I'm a history major. Lieutenant Ortega was a fermentation science major. The electronic tools that we saw that were at our disposal, open source, that were either free or on a budget, we would have to spend more time learning, like how Pigeon had mentioned earlier, Vassal. We didn't have the time to fully comprehend and understand everything that program could give us. And so we had explored different ways of using electronics. However, we also decided that for a immersion standpoint for those players, it was more important that you had people in uniform. You're holding documents that say top secret. It's in the right type font. It's in a certain formatting. It was we decided to use pen and paper to our advantage to create more of a liminal space. They were even handed manila folders that said top secret, like you're in Mission Impossible. And they had to keep that folder with them and not let other people look in it. And so it primed them more for the experience they were going to be walking into later that day. So I hope that answers it.
Thank you very much. We got another one from John, who notes, in describing the wargaming exercise played to date, you seem to have run the game with known parameters for equipments. His question is, have you considered introducing fictional new experimental equipment assets with new capabilities, something that would be a real game changer?
For this specific war game, we were focusing with whatever open source information that we had. For the development process that we had went through, we didn't consider it. The most that we had considered was the implementation of a strategic bomber. However, for this specific war game, we wanted to focus on like a humanitarian airlift. We didn't really consider any experimental craft or capabilities, because we wanted the cadets to be familiar, see things that were familiar to them, or read words that were familiar to them, because many of these kids, many of these underclassmen don't have a military background. This might be their first experience to the military, or maybe they have a very limited experience in the military. And so we wanted to really focus on, without them actually being in a real operations room, what can we do to create an atmosphere, or paragraphs or a story that felt familiar, felt real to them. And just for that specific game, we didn't think about any experimental like capabilities or game changers, because it was more they were having to respond to, again, like what would be from an open source perspective, what would be something that could happen, what would be a weather shift that might impact your stuff. So the real weather, the real game changers were actually like weather reports of, oh, this route's closed, this route you have to carry less stuff. But that's definitely something that'd be very interesting going forward for our next game. So I really appreciate it.
Actually, can I add to that too?
Yeah.
This is a little bit of me potentially putting words into Nick's mouth and potentially Cadet mouths. We had talked, I don't want to say not terribly seriously, but we had bandying around the idea of like what would it take to run a multi-day game where you weren't limited to 90 minutes, but maybe had 2 or 3 days, and that could expand the realm of possibilities of the type of equipment that could be used, strategies or operations that could be pondered, as long as it met the objective. Just the two walls you run into are time and cost. Certainly, I think time is probably far bigger here at the detachment than the cost is. Like if we're running pen and paper, it's negligible. But like say if I understand correctly, Nicholas, I'm an old OTS grad, so I don't know that much about how the training blocks in Air Force ROTC, but you actually have these limited windows you can work with. Like you basically say you have 90 minutes and that's all you had, and you had to say, well, there's my guardrails, that I'm limited by what I can build in there. But if we have buy-in from the colonel, it's the kind of thing you can kind of start whispering in his ear and say, hey, sir, what do you think about doing a multi-day game? And see what he thinks. Who knows?
Absolutely.
We have a follow-up question from John. Do you see current format playable between wing to wing over Zoom in different parts of the country?
Absolutely. I think that's just a matter of collaboration, because it's the same thing as setting up separate Zoom rooms. And like back when we all were during the pandemic, they had the little like the breakout rooms, and so you have your main cell as the main room, and then you could break out into Alpha 1, Alpha 2, Alpha 3, and then within there you have your logistics, operations, and command structure. And so you can still run it the same way virtually, or as like Pigeon ran in his class that we did the war game in. He set up a Discord, and within the Discord there was text channels, voice channels. To me, it's more just a matter of collaboration, communication, and formatting. But you could run the same or similar game virtually.
The advice I give is I actually have given a one-off class on running online games. The trick is to find a tool that everyone knows how to use. The more simple it is, and the larger the user base, the easier it is to get everyone online. So yeah, most people know how to use Zoom at this point, or you could use even Google Meet, or do people use Microsoft Teams? I think they do. And whatever happened to Skype? But also, like, Discord looks complicated to somebody who's never used it before, but it's really, really easy to set up and use. So basically, you want to if you're going to run an online game, you got to make it just as simple as possible to get everybody onboarded. I also advise people to get really, really good at knowing how to use like 2 or 3 tools. Like, so I can run a game on Slack or Discord. I can use a couple of different virtual tabletops. And I know how to use a couple of different communications apps like this, if you will. And I found that most people now do, so it's easy to get a game together.
We have a question from Francis who asks, besides the after-action reports, is data compiled to review and assess recurring or common obstacles the cadets find the most challenging and could be reviewed as teachable moments?
For this war game, we had that left up to the individual evaluators. Like I said, they were filling out like a standardized fleet form, and so as the course of the game was going on, the evaluators could take note of where their struggle points were or where it was going a little bit easier for them. Some of the evaluators gave us those fleet forms. Some of them handed them to the cadets, but that was handled mostly on a group by group basis. And the forms that we received back showed that they were struggling where they were like supposed to, like when we added more smoke or we made things a little more difficult through our injects, but that they were overall able to use their team well, delegate well, and lead well. But we didn't anything as a club find any main struggle points that were worth documenting. And from individual cadets, they received those learning moments from their evaluators.
In a way, you could also think that the spring game was the sourdough from which we start building that kind of institutional knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I have one last question. It looks like we've gotten all the ones in the chat, but in terms of the player base between your first and your second iteration, did you have repeat players? And if so, did you notice kind of any adaptations they made between that? Where they, did they adopt certain strategies that they learned during the first iteration?
Definitely. We had several repeat players. A lot of the freshmen became the sophomores, and the sophomores, a lot of them became the juniors. And so there was a lot of repeat players within that sophomore tier. And so we decided that we saw actually they used a lot of their skills from the previous war game to adapt and learn the rules in the world of the current one. Sophomores that had experience to the previous war game when they were freshmen learned faster and were starting to try different things within the world before the freshmen who had never done anything like this before. And so with that in mind, though, we kind of had an idea of that going on, and we wanted to keep getting the best data and give them the most authentic experience by putting them into a new situation. Overall, they were still moving, struggling as much as the other players who maybe not had as much experience. And that was our control, to try and put them in a totally different scenario so that repeat players got a new experience out of this and new players got a similar experience. And so kind of as Pigeon was talking about, building up not just the institutional kind of data bank, but that the cadets themselves build up their own personal data bank of experiences, learning, okay, when there's a pen and paper scenario, here's how I can learn and understand the world. When there's actual units moving in the real world, here's where I can take my leadership skills and adaptability and apply it to coordinate units. Yeah, the only thing that was very similar, I think, that repeat players kind of caught on and utilized was the organization of the command structure and kind of how the communication channels were routed up. But other than that, they got a fairly new experience overall.
Yeah, thank you so much for answering the questions. Unless we have any more in the next like 5 seconds, we're just gonna wrap it up and turn back over to you for any last comments that you guys wanted to make. Starting with you, Nick.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I say thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it. Like I said before, we're at Air Force ROTC Detachment 90 at Colorado State University. And as far as we know, we're the only ones doing this. So if you're at a detachment or an academy or, SOS or OCS, I don't know how those stuff works as much, but any of that stuff and want to collaborate on war games either together or one you want to build and run at your debt, reach out to us. Happy to help, happy to collaborate, and looking forward to hearing from all of you.
Also, how can they contact you? What's your email? What's your
I
contact
believe
info?
if you, I can put my email. I have a LinkedIn profile. Should have my contact info on there. If you just look up Nicholas Kauza, Kauza. Additionally, I have an email, nicholas.kauza@gmail. It's just my first name dot last name at gmail.com, and more than happy to answer questions and talk and collaborate. So please reach out.
Perfect. Well, I guess we'll wrap it up now.